recording. Okay, welcome to the Transforming Assessment series. This is about our October session. Gosh, the year has gone fast. The presenter today is Dr. Amy Wong. She's from Queen's University, Belfast at the moment, a former colleague at University of Queensland, actually, as it happens. She'll be speaking about examiner judgment in competency-based assessments. So, Amy, would you like to begin, please?
Thank you. Just get my slides ready. Yes. Many thanks, Matthew, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Transforming Assessment session on examiner judgment in competency-based assessment. Before we begin, I'll tell you a little bit about my background. I completed my PhD in May last year, as Matthew said, at the University of Queensland in Australia. My doctoral study was about exploring the consistencies of examiner judgment in medical education using a mixed methods case study approach. I then moved to Belfast to take up my current position as a research fellow with the School of Nursing and Midwifery in August 2019. Before moving to Belfast, I worked at UQ for about 11 years with students, medical and nursing educators in assessment design, curriculum development, and quality assurance research. I would like to acknowledge my PhD supervision team, Associate Professor Karen Mooney, Professor Jill Thistlethwaite, Associate Professor Lata Valamundi, and Chris Roberts for their guidance and support during my 5 years part-time PhD journey, and my current Professor Christine Brown-Wilson for her support to my continuing research in the areas of examiner judgments and student assessment. Let's start our section today. This is an outline of today's presentation. First of all, I will discuss the context of my doctoral research in higher and medical education. Then I'll share with you the key findings, that is, the key factors that influence the consistencies of examiner judgments of student performance. Then I will discuss the outcomes of providing examiners with structured feedback as strategies to mitigate the inconsistencies of examiner judgment. Finally, I'll talk about the future directions of research in this area, and feel free to join in the discussion through the chat, as well as asking questions in the Q&A at the end. So in recent decades, higher education institutions globally have been regulated by new modes of governance that emphasize performance, quality, and accountability. The use of assessment data has been and will continue to be prominent and critical for quality assurance and accountability requirements in higher education. For example, student academic results have been used as a comparison of the quality of education provided by the higher education institutes. However, as we all know, student assessment should not only fulfill the summative purpose of reporting individual student achievement across a specific period of time to make high-stakes decisions, but also, very importantly, to fulfill the formative purpose of providing students with feedback about their current progress to guide their future learning. The tensions between these two functions of assessment and their often conflicting purposes have led to calls for assessment reforms in higher education to address the risk of using assessment practices to satisfy only the strategic purpose of measuring student outcomes, while not providing students with enough support for their academic development and learning. Competency-based assessment has been suggested that as it could fulfill both the summative and formative purposes depending on how and when we implement it throughout the student learning journey. In fact, competency-based assessment reframes assessment as informing judgments about the progress of student learning instead of only focusing on making decisions about student selection, progression, and certification. However, the notion of professional judgment of student performance has raised questions about the consistencies of examiner judgments, and previous research suggested that consistencies of examiner judgments has been considered as problematic. Before we continue our discussion, I would like to know your thoughts on the following question. With your experience as an examiner or a learning designer or a consultant, what do you see as the major challenges in making judgments on student performance? Let's share your response by logging onto the website www.menti.com, and Matthew had put the link on the chat box. You can use your mobile phone or open another tab on your browser. Type in the digital code 27, 66, and 29 and type away your answers. So what do you see as the major challenges in making judgments on student performance? Great, excellent. See responses coming through. Let's keep them going. Unconscious bias, subjectivity, equity, yes. Fairness, validity, defining standard, that's great. We'll talk about that in the discussion later on. Varying expectations, perfect. Different ideas. Consistencies, yes, is saying it out loud on the screen. Consistencies. Experience of youngsters, that's great. Objectivity, hawks. Whether it is a meaningful task. Comparability, what we are comparing with. Realistic assessment. Different ideas, clarity of criteria. Perfect. Reasonable adjustment, yes. Fairness, yes. Excellent. Any more ideas about the major challenges of student performance? Very good. Excellent. So we've got the ideas of consistencies that what we're talking about, subjectivity, validity, unconscious biases. Thank you. Thank you very much for your participation. We'll jump back to the main discussion.
Okay, I'll put your slides up again.
Yes, thank you. Just need to adjust my screen. Great. Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation. Your responses definitely reflect some of the major challenges of examiner judgment in competency-based assessment presented in the literature. One of the major challenges of examiner judgments in competency-based assessment is the different interpretation of the given marking criteria or standards. Someone mentioned it in the chat, in the Mentimeter before. And these differences may be due to a lack of shared understanding of the given criteria and their implication for practice. Or examiners actively apply their own concepts of additional criteria to make judgments. Since competency-based assessment has been widely adopted in higher education, such as in the pre-registration medicine and nursing programs, accreditation process for social work, and professional validation for the Commonwealth Association of Architects, just to name a few, it is very important to develop a deeper understanding of the key factors that influence examiner judgment, which will guide higher education institutes to design and implement fit-for-purpose examiner professional development in this area, and most importantly, to provide students with a fair assessment of their performance. In my PhD studies, I explored the key factors that impact on the robustness of the examiner judgments and strategies for mitigating inconsistency in the context of medical education. What is central to the investigation of my study is the objective structured clinical examination. And I'll spend a few minutes to talk about what is an OSCE. So an OSCE is an example of competency-based assessment. In an OSCE, students are required to complete the task specified in a series of time stations. This example on the slide, 5 stations in this OSCE. And say students need to complete each station within a specific time limit, for example, 9 minutes. They are presented with a standardized clinical scenario in each station. Some of the scenarios are presented with only written information, and some involve simulated patients. The examiners observe students undertaking the required clinical tasks and grade their performance according to an objective checklist or Likert-type global evaluation scale. The OSCE acts as a means to increase the reliability of assessing students' clinical competencies as students are presented with standardized information or the patients in terms of their clinical problems. And therefore, you would think that students' responses and scores should be more comparable. And it is the reason the perceived characteristic of objective testing is the main reason for the widespread use of OSCE to minimize the reliability problems in oral clinical examination. However, it is questionable as to whether the perceived characteristics of the OSCE could always be achievable, and why not? Just to give you a little bit more about the research context of my study, which was conducted in the Research Intensive Australian University. In Australia, there is no national licensing examination to become a medical practitioner. Each medical school develops its own final exam, for example, an OSCE, based on the curriculum accredited by the Australian Medical Council. It is similar to others, such as in the UK at the current time. However, the UK is introducing the medical licensing assessment from 2024. The focus of my study is the high-state OSCE for the final year undergraduate medical students. The final year OSCE is a high-stakes assessment as students' results have a direct impact on their ability to graduate and thus commence an internship as a qualified medical doctor in the following year. There are 2 parts of my study. The qualitative part aims to explore the key factors that influence examiner judgment, which was informed by 17 semi-structured interviews with the examiners. The quantitative part aims to explore the impact of providing examiners with feedback on their marking behavior. A total of 141 examiners' scores in the pre-feedback OSCE and 111 examiners' scores in the post-feedback OSCE were analysed. Given that the research participants, that is the OSCE examiners, were involved in both or either university or work-based contexts, the finding addressed the challenges of judging student performance in both contexts, and therefore they are transferable and applicable to other disciplines using competency-based assessments in higher education. Let's look into the semi-structured interviews with the OSCE examiners and explore the key factors that influence the consistency of examiner judgment. I reflected critically on the examiners' responses of their and perceptions of their judgment practices using cultural historical activity theory, CHAT, to explore the key factors that influence the examiner's judgments. CHAT offers a multidimensional and systemic approach to explore a comprehensive set of dynamic factors such as cultural, history, and examiner social interactions that may influence examiner judgment of student performance. These figures, remember these figures because when we talk about the key factors, we'll come back to the elements in these figures. This figure shows the activity system within the medical school OSCE context. It is made up of the OSCE station marking criteria, which is the tools which mediate the OSCE examiner's subject actions to fulfill the goal, which is the object of making judgment. In this context, the interactions among the elements of rules, set up by the medical school and the Australian Medical Council, their community groups within the examiner cohort, and division of labour according to the experience of the OSCE examiners are expected to support the examiners to achieve the desired outcome of assessing medical students' competency in progressing to the next stage of clinical training. However, these interactions have the potential to create tensions if the examiners have different beliefs, perceptions, expectations, and practices within an activity system. In the next few slides, we'll explore the key factors that create these tensions within the activity system, which will influence the consistencies of examiner judgment. The first key factors that influence the consistency of examiner judgment of student performance is the examiner's conflicting beliefs about the purpose of an assessment task. Over half of these examiners believe that the OSCE is a fair and reasonable but high-stake final hurdle for the students. And the OSCE assess students in a simulated environment which essentially evaluate their ability to pass an examination. As reflected in the first quote, when students have graduated, knowing well they will learn more when they are the first-year doctor rather than what they've learned so far, the examiners felt confident that the medical students could learn more and acquire the necessary skills later on the job when they undertook their internships after graduation. However, there was another group of examiners held a conflicting belief that the final year OSCE was the last opportunity to ensure that only students who achieved the clinical competency requirements were awarded the opportunity to progress to internships. These examiners perceive that they play a gatekeeper role in this OSCE as illustrated in the second quote. Overall, you have responsibility to the university and the community, not just to let somebody through who perhaps has difficulties that may carry through if someone doesn't pick it up and deal with it at the time. These conflicting examiners' belief also influence the level of support provided to students, such as prompting students during the exam. This is similar to the debates in other disciplines in higher education, such as how much guidance and support we should provide students with to make an assessment task meaningful in terms of challenging their abilities, as well as creating a learning experience for them. The provision of prompts provided an opportunity for the students to be awarded higher marks. This is problematic as these examiners' behaviour create inequity among the students, particularly for those who were not given any prompts. The second key factor that influences the consistency of examiner judgments is the examiner's varying perceptions of the marking criteria. A specific marking criteria sheet for each OSCE station was developed by the clinicians and the medical educators within the medical school. A number of examiners indicated that the marking criteria were useful in terms of helping them to construct a framework of meaning of their observations of student performance. They applied the marking criteria to guide them and the students about the requirements of an OSCE station as indicated by examiners 13. I do use that marking criteria sheet to make sure that I'm on track with what's expected, but also if the students need any help along the way to guide them back to where they were supposed to be. However, when the marking criteria did not capture the essence of the station, such as safe practice or the specifics of passing or failing students, the examiners would diverge from the given marking criteria and make up their own as explained by examiner 3. I just thought that the marking criteria wasn't capturing the essence of the station. And if the marking criteria do not reflect sensibilities, I will diverge from that a little. These examiners' responses imply that the examiners did not share the same understanding of the marking criteria. Therefore, the objectivity of examiner judgment become questionable as students may be inequitably assessed with different marking criteria. The third key factors that influence the consistencies of examiner judgment is the examiner's divergent expectations of student performance. The interviews with the examiners indicated that their expectation of final year medical students' competency were impacted by cultural, historical, and social influences. From the cultural perspective, the OSCE examiners were recruited from a range of medical specialties. The examiners adjusted their expectations depending on whether the station was assessing student competency in their medical specialties. Examiner 17, who was allocated to a station in her medical specialties, adjusted her expectations to be more lenient. I'm very aware when I'm examining in an OSCE station that is my specialty. I try and err on the side of leniency because I don't want to disadvantage the students because of my knowledge. However, examiner 13, who was allocated to a station which was different from his medical specialty, appeared to be more lenient in his expectations. If you are doing a station where you really aren't involved in that area, then you probably are likely to be more lenient. In the higher education context, it may happen when a group of tutors from different areas of a discipline are marking students' essay or oral presentations. With respect to historical factors, the examiner's experience of being OSCE examiners created both a dominant and a subordinate voice in the examiner community. The less experienced examiners were inclined to follow the decisions made by the experienced OSCE examiners, as illustrated by the response from examiner 13. I'll give you a few seconds to have a read of the response from examiner 13 on the slide. Furthermore, social expectation of the intern's competency in the clinical work environment also impacted on the examiner's expectations of the student's OSCE performance. Underperforming interns create additional operational cost and cause dissatisfaction from other members of the clinical teams who need to cover the work that the intern should be doing. And there are two most evidence and social expectations of the examiners are safe practice and effective communications with patients in the real life situation, as indicated by examiner 5. The fourth year students, they're just a step away from being doctors. So you need to be able to say, well, this person know what they're talking about, or they will be okay, safe with the patient, particularly in a few weeks' time. You've just got to adjust your judgment that way. We can see that there is a range of social cultural factors instigated the examiners to adopt their selected, presumably different marking criteria and practices, which is problematic as the use of different marking practices influences the consistencies of examiner judgments. Last but not least, the fourth factor that influenced examiners' judgments was their idiosyncratic marking practices. These practices were interrelated with their beliefs about their assessment, which was affected by their perceptions of the usefulness of the marking criteria and their expectations of student performance. The first consideration is student attitudes, which appears to be pivotal when the examiners had to decide whether they offer students assistance during the examination process and when the examiners has to make a pass or fail decision. Examiner 3 discussed this point in quite a bit of details. And this one other thing that will sway me, and that their attitude towards the examiner process. If the students become a little bit aggressive or they're not treating the process with respect, then they're half and half, and that's more likely to tip me towards a fail. Some examiners consider student attitude, which were not specified in the marking criteria, whereas some decided not to consider student attitude as part of their judgment. This scenario probably resonates with the situation of assessing students in performance-based assessment in other higher education disciplines. and opposing marking behavior created tensions among the examiners and inconsistencies of their judgment. The second consideration is to pass or fail students who are at the borderline. Due to the high-stake nature of the final year OSCE, the examiners devoted additional time to judge students as borderline. Despite the fact that students were prepared to fail students, as indicated by Examiner 9, but I'm comfortable enough failing someone, but usually after a lot of thought and probably leaning towards what is there, that I maybe push them over the line. Lenient examiners were more likely to pass students when considering the implications of delaying the commencement of students' internship after graduation. Based on these findings, what I propose is a model showing the interrelationship between the four key factors identified and the additional factors of emotions as the core mechanism in influencing examiners on their judgments of student performance. The examiners did indicate their emotion play a substantial part in their judgments of student performance. They reviewed different emotions throughout the process of assessing students in the OSCE. Some examiners were satisfied with the existing marking criteria, whereas some were frustrated with the lack of details outlined on the marking criteria. One examiner was disappointed and disagreed with the decisions made by the chief examiners regarding the marking standard in one of the OSCE stations. This examiner decided to self-determine her judgment of student performance in this station. Therefore, I propose that emotion should be the fifth latent factor in the core mechanism of making judgments of student performance. This model, based on the CHAT, the cultural historical activities theory system, create a practical resource in developing professional development to facilitate reflections and discussions about examiners' perceptions and biases in judging students' performance. It's also informed my current research to co-design a roadmap of professional development with educators across a range of disciplines, which I'll briefly discuss later on. This concludes the findings of the qualitative part of my study. Let's move on to talk about the impact of providing examiners with structured feedback as a means to mitigate their inconsistencies. I conducted a quasi-experimental study using generalizability theory to analyze the examiner's scores awarded to students before and after feedback. Just very briefly, G theory acknowledges that the examiner scores in an OSCE are the combination of the true score of a student performance and multiple sources of error variances. By conducting a G study, we are able to quantify the contributions of error variance by each source. Among all error variances in examiner judgments, examiner stringency or the Hall effect is the source of error that I'm most interested in. And I define examiner stringency as the examiner's disposition to being consistently harsh or consistently lenient in their judgments. In the OSCE, before any feedback was given to the examiners, the proportion of variance contributed by the examiner's stringency is around 23%, and students' ability was around 16%. Around 20%. The proportion of variance contributed by the examiner's stringency was considerably large. This raises a particular concern that the scores awarded by the examiners may not necessarily reflect the student's actual performance, but rather that the examiner's scores were heavily influenced by their own stringency. So 23 versus 20. So after the pre-feedback OSCE, I provided examiners with an individualized structured examiner's report on their marking behavior. There are three parts of the structured report. Part 1 provides examiners with data about the mean and range of scores given for an OSCE station. The graph shows the distribution of an examiner's scores awarded to students in a station. The y-axis shows the ranking of students in terms of their scores awarded in a descending order. This provides a quick way to show the range of scores given to the number of students within the station. And in other higher education contexts, you can modify that within a particular question. Part 2 of the report shows the comparison of an examiner's score to the other examiners in the same station. A box plot was used to illustrate the maximum, the 75th percentile, medium, 25th percentile, and the minimum scores given by each examiner. The box plots also shows the presence of outliers. Let's look at Examiner 1. Examiner 1, the medium score awarded to students was 24 with no outliers. And if we look at the line between inside the box, you can see that and compare that with the rest of the examiners in this group, you can see that Examiners 1 is quite lenient. Part 3 showed the comparison of an examiner's mean percentage score with those of all the examiners involved in the examiner using a bar chart. Each examiner was informed of their rank on the continuum from the most stringent first to the most lenient 141st examiner. This feedback report was intended to prompt examiners to reflect on their marking behavior by exploring the patterns of their score and the comparisons with the cohort. The content of this feedback report is not discipline specific and is applicable to other disciplines in higher education. So part 1, part 2, and part 3. Just before we're moving on, just with the introduction of part 1, part 2, and part 3 of the feedback report, I would like to know which part of the structure examiner feedback do you think would be most useful? A, B, or C? Part 1, part 2, or part 3? Let's go back to the Mentimeter, type in the digital code 27, 66, and 29, and let us know your preference. Go for it, everyone. And Matthew, I've already put the link on the chat box as well. Yep, now you can vote. Thank you. Share. Right. Great. Excellent. So it seems that part 2 would be most useful. Great. I would agree with that because it provides actually the most details in terms of among the 3 parts of the report. Great. Perfect. Right. Part 2 is the winner. Let's share back my presentation. Thank you, Matthew. Yes, it's also compare the like to like question. Yes, perfect. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. Let's have a look at the results from the examiners. We compare the examiners who assess students in both pre and post feedback OSCE. Result shows that the size of examiner stringency variance contributed to about 16% to the student score, about 7% reduction compared with before feedback was provided, and the student's ability contributed to the overall variation of the score was around 16 in the post-feedback OSCE. We're very aware of the different cohorts of students may have different levels and range of abilities, and this could potentially have influenced the examiner judgments. Therefore, I conducted further analysis of the examiner's scores. To further investigate the decrease in the examiner's stringency after feedback and control for the differences in stations, I compared the examiners who assess students again in both pre and post feedback OSCE in at least one common station, one common question. Results again reveal the size of examiner's stringency variance contribute to about 17% of the student score, about 7% reduction compared with before feedback was provided. The student's ability contributed to the overall variation of the examiner's score was similar, 17 and 16 in pre and post feedback OSCE. Both reductions shown appears to be associated with a possible impact of structure feedback on decreasing the contribution of the examiner's stringency variance to their scores in the post-feedback OSCE. However, we are aware of the limitations of this quasi-experimental study. Primary constraint was that this G study was contingent on the assessment data from large-scale OSCEs in which the examiner judging plan was entirely pragmatic and not modifiable to gain better estimates of the variance components in the examiner's scores. And although the feedback mechanism may well have reduced the examiner's stringency variance, other factors may have contributed to it. For example, as the OSCE examiners gain experience in assessing students, it is possible that they introduce less variance into their scores, regardless of the provision of the feedback about their marking behavior. Nevertheless, this study has offered preliminary support to the possible impact of structure feedback to their examiners on their marking behavior. So, how did the examiners perceive the feedback? In the context of my study, the OSCE examiners had not previously received any form of feedback about their OSCE marking behavior. The provision of structured feedback was a novel practice in which the examiners had an opportunity to compare their marking behavior with those of the rest of their cohort. Most of the examiners indicated that the structured feedback was useful in terms of reassuring them about their judgment, and the examiners perceived the structured feedback as a communication channel between the medical school and the examiners, a means of comparing examiners' marking behavior with those of the examiners' cohort, and a means of facilitating examiners' self-reflection on their marking behavior. And the structured feedback was particularly important for the less experienced OSCE examiners. However, it appears that examiners' resistance to change their marking practice is one of the major challenges of enhancing the consistencies of examiner judgment. Those biases are very hard to eliminate because that's what we just all do. Or because I know I was lie to the students and I know medicine is not black or white, so it probably won't change too much. So in summary, the structured feedback creates an authentic learning opportunity for examiners to formally review and reflect on their marking behavior and potentially make subsequent evidence-based decisions to enhance the consistencies of their judgments. In the next slide, I'll explain why this is particularly important under the current COVID-19 pandemic. So the COVID-19 pandemic has created an urgency for educators to rethink and redesign the assessment practice of using high-stake exit assessment to make students' progression decisions. particularly for competency-based professional degree programs in a range of disciplines: healthcare, law, social work, and education. These high-stakes assessments usually involve face-to-face examinations, which are unlikely to remain feasible under the social distancing measures and may not be easily modified as virtual assessment. Without these high-stakes assessments, it is a challenge for university offering competency-based professional programs to make decisions about student performance in preparation for obtaining a professional qualification. More importantly, the quality of graduates may also be compromised, which may have a direct impact on the confidence of members of the public assessing services that these graduates provide. It is timely to consider a programmatic approach of assessment which involves students undertaking and assessing making judgments of students' performance in a series of assessments both within the university and during their professional placement throughout the duration of their course. Programmatic assessment facilitates sampling and accrediting and combining multiple data points to make high-stakes decisions for students' progression. This approach enables accountable and defensible high-stakes decisions being made using multiple data points. However, the key to successful programmatic assessment heavily depends on assessment judgments in both academic and practice settings. It is therefore critical to facilitate assessor in developing a greater understanding of the associated factors that influence their judgments of student performance in both academic and practice settings, and to provide a fair assessment to students' performance. In light of the current situation, I'm leading a pilot study of co-designing a roadmap of professional development and feedback strategies for assessors across disciplines that could be most effective in facilitating assessor understanding of their judgment behaviour and making defensible judgment with Queen's University Belfast. We use a co-design approach which will enable us to develop fit-for-purpose resources that address the participants' professional development needs. And throughout the co-design approach, the participant will also enhance their understanding of the socio-cultural factors that could impact their judgment of student performance and the implications for assessment practices. We will adapt the co-design model to develop strategies to improve communication in terms of providing feedback to the assessors. To move forward this project after the pilot study, we are looking for national and international collaborators. So if you're interested to be part of it, please email me and I'll be in touch. In conclusion, I would like you to take home 3 messages from this session. So first of all, the 5 key factors that influence examiner judgments of students' performance, which are the examiner's beliefs, perceptions, expectation, and idiosyncratic practices, as well as their emotions. Second, the possibility of providing examiners structured feedback about their marking judgments, and the value of collaborating with examiners to develop effective strategies in making defensible judgment, which will provide students with a fair assessment of their performance and will do justice to the students, examiners, and the general public. Thank you. And the next couple of slides is the references. And this is my contact details.
Thanks, Amy. If you'd like to do some question and answer, Claudia has asked a question in the text chat. Is there any pre-OSCE moderation done normally?
Not that I know of in my context of research.
Okay, we had it just for the reference slide. I'll just stick the reference slide back up. Yep. It's all captured in the recording as well, folks. So I will probably have the recording up in about an hour's time, or thereabouts, if you're that keen. If you have any other questions, pop them into the chat. If you would like to ask a question via the microphone, you may just stick up your virtual hand using the hands up symbol. And you can.
I think Mike may put up his hand.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mike.
Right. I wonder if you could clarify a couple of points for me. First of all, in terms of competency, is this pass-fail, but you put up scores? And the second thing is you seem to have a ground truth when you were working out the variability of the examiners. You seem to have a correct marking compared to what they marked. I'm a bit confused. Could you explain that?
Okay, so the first questions in competency-based assessment, it should be pass or fail. However, we need to adhere to the university rule of grading the students for awards as well. So that's why there are differences between marking pass and fail and marking with the scores.
Right, but could you explain? So just on that, was there variability in the pass-fail as opposed to the scores? In other words, yeah, you showed variability in scores, and clearly there might be variability in scores, but in terms of whether the examiners passed or failed students, and I mean, in our university, you know, for undergraduates it's 40%, and for masters it's 50%. But did you look at the variability in the pass-fail criteria as opposed to the actual score given?
Yes, so for the pass, there is not much of a difference between pass and fail. In fact, majority of the students pass, and that's why I didn't look at the pass and fail. I look at the actual scores, and the examiners mark when they mark the actual marking standard.
Right, the definition of competency isn't the mark, it's pass-fail, isn't it?
Yes.
Right, and the other question, you when you worked out this variability, you had this equation, you know, you said the actual score plus variability. So did you have a ground truth expert? How did you decide what the correct score was?
The correct score for each station?
Well, yes,
Do you mean?
Yeah, you put an equation up. You said, you know, the score of an examiner is the correct score plus the variability.
Yes.
And
But
what is
the pass and the fails, it depends on how how we set up use the standard marking to work out the pass and fail for each station. So there is not ground rule for the actual pass mark for each station.
Right, I'm a bit confused. Could you put that slide back up? Yeah, that one. You've got true score. What is the true score?
Well, this is just a framework of the generalizability theory, saying that its examiner's score is actually a combination of the true score and the other variability. And my focus is looking at the examiner's stringency as one of the sources of the error variances. So I'm not trying to find a true score of the student's performance. I'm looking at the variances contributed by the examiners as one of the error variances.
Okay.
I guess it's a conceptual formula rather than an actual formula. That's what we're trying.
That's how I'm trying to explain generalizability theory in one slide.
Right, because normally when people are doing the sort of thing with examination, there would be trained examiners and some examples where a true score would be given, and they would learn to moderate their marks based on. I mean, that's what happens in the British A-level system, and there's training for examiners by giving them where the true score has been decided by experts, whatever, and the examiners can try and learn how to make their marks meet this.
Sounds to be that this situation is a bit of training in reverse. So Amy said that there wasn't any sort of moderation done, pre-moderation, if you will, in this case, which
Not in my
admittedly
context.
to me sounds strange, given it's a very high stakes exam, but perhaps that's just the way they run things. And Amy's gone in and done some research to try and look at, well, is that current practice effective? Clearly not, because there's much variance in it. Yeah. Would that be an accurate statement, Amy?
Yes. I'm just saying, I'm just looking at the chat. The formula is a statistical language, and I try to explain it in one slide. So sorry about the confusion, but I'm happy to chat afterwards.
Right, and also I'm aware of other examples where these true examples are given to peer assessments for students so they can learn to self-assess themselves. This is assessment for learning approach.
Yes, it sort of goes to the, I guess if you ask my opinion of the thing, there's a lot of old practices still around, in the sense that people are still hanging on to the way they used to do things, and let's just say better practice such as moderation, criteria referenced assessment, etc., is still new practices in some places. And this kind of research, I think, helps us understand and reinforce, what we know or what we now believe is better methods of doing assessment. As Silas Taylor has commented in the text chat, yes, it should be reasonably standard process in terms of moderate pre-session moderation meetings and things, coming to a shared understanding of the criteria, but perhaps that's not necessarily the case everywhere.
And that's why triggered me to continue to do the research, because in different contexts, there could be different practices and a different way to design fit for purposes professional development for examiners, both in the university context and in the practice context. Johanna got a genuine question. Are consultant doctors more resistant to change than the others? Not necessarily in my research.
Thanks, Tim. I'll stick that on the reference, actually, on the reference page. So Tim Hunt's given a reference for you. You might want to have a look at, Amy.
Thank you.
So a question came up: how do you get away from these high stakes exams and still maintain integrity? I guess it's probably perhaps more of a general question. It is certainly something that we're tackling globally at the moment, with the fact that high stakes traditional exams are a lot harder to do at the moment. So people are having to think of alternative assessments.
And that's why the idea of the programmatic assessment or the programmatic approach of assessment comes through. It's just that we're trying to get as many data points throughout the student's journey and make a high-stake decision at the end, and not just relying on one single exam to make a high-stake decision.
Yep. I mean, it still requires moderation and things like that, so that people understand what the standards are. People have a common understanding of what the standards are.
Definitely.
Deirdre's got an interesting comment. We try to hammer home this message to examiners in the pre-briefing: stick to the marking guidelines. Do you think examiners deliberately ignore this message when they decide to adapt the guidelines, or maybe it's just a more human thing? As the day goes on, examiners get tired or bored or get distracted.
And I think it's more of a human nature. They obviously try really hard to stick to the marking criteria or guidelines, but sometimes it's a human nature, and particularly when, and I reflect to myself as well when I was the examiners. I know the students got the knowledge in them, but you just at that moment you really try to get that out from the students, and you genuinely want them to be successful. And I think it's just that balance between sticking to the marking criteria, or like at that moment in time that you really want to help the student to get through the line.
Some interesting comments coming up. Things like seniority, time of the day, always also reporting to as having an impact.
Yes,
first
definitely.
day versus subsequent days. Yep. Anybody who's done marking of hundreds of papers will understand this.
And particularly with the OSCE, we're running 4 different sessions, morning and afternoon in the weekend, and all these examiners are volunteers. Yes.
Yep. We are fighting nature. Humans are not robots, thankfully.
But I think with the co-design strategies, we're hoping to include the examiners, the educators on the ground to develop a resource that is applicable to them, that they can is sort of like try to make them more aware of their marking behavior when they mark students. And I understand that a certain degree of subjectivity is unavoidable, and I'm not trying to make it to 0, but it's just trying to make the examiners more aware of what they're doing when they mark students' performance. Do you see a role of observation in workplace of entrustable professional activities play in ensuring the standardizing and improving assessment? Yes, definitely.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. We're now at 7 p.m. Sydney time and no doubt 9 a.m. in the UK. That sort of brings our sessions to a conclusion. However, if you are wanting to stick around and ask any further questions, you are most welcome to do that. We'll be around for a couple of minutes. But otherwise, if you could kindly fill in our feedback survey that I'm typed just to put into the chat, that would be fantastic. Otherwise, we shall see you all back actually, I'll put up just a notice slide for the last one, if I can manage to find what I did.
And while Matthew is doing that, thank you very much for your participation, and I'm more than welcome of any future discussion and collaborations.
Sure, get in touch with Amy. She's Googleable. She's in LinkedIn. So if the next session's coming up is actually a double. We've got defending assessment against e-cheating, and we've got reimagining assessment for robot-proof our assessments, if I remember rightly. The name of the person's gone out of my head now, sorry. But they're really good sessions, so have a look on our website. That will show you who's presenting them. Apologies for forgetting their names. It's my bad memory coming through again. But thanks, folks, and we'll see you in about a month's time. And thank you very much, Amy.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I'm about to say thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.